One thing is simply the use of language. If English is not your first language, or you tend to write awkwardly, sometimes you think you're not a good writer because your word choice is bad. But that's one skill that you can work on, like literally like a dictionary skill, like choosing great vocabulary and choosing great imagery, right? That's one skill. Second skill is taking a character through a journey. It's actually understanding the psychology of people and understanding if I'm think I'm ugly, how do I walk through the world? How does a character overcome the belief that I'm ugly, right? And that's actually an understanding of people, an understanding of psychology. And you want to know that so you can create characters that are deep and interesting, and you want to be a great observer of your friends, of your parents, of all the people who annoy you, right? So that you can document who they are, but also understand them from an interesting perspective. That's a different skill. Then there's another skill, which is, especially for filmmaking, is being able to show, not tell. Being able to ground all of your scenes in moments that are visual, that give all the information you want to give, but don't have it me tell you, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, right? And the last one, which is probably the most important one, and very difficult for people to do, is to really speak from your authentic voice. And we want so much as writers to be seen and to be heard, and we know that we have something to say, and that desire, that longing, can pull us out of ourselves. And when you get pulled out of yourself, then you're trying to imitate Breaking Bad, you're trying to imitate Scandal, you're trying to imitate some movie that you love. And you've lost your sense of what it is that you're bringing to the world, what you've seen in the world. So finding that authentic voice and saying, what I know is valuable, what I see is valuable, the way I'm going to show it is valuable, is a skill in itself. And it's the practice of actually affirming your unique vision. Like being able to go into a Starbucks even and saying, the way I order my Starbucks, the way I like my pasta, the way I like to cross the street, the way I like to drive is unique and valuable. And the more you anchor into the sense of your own value and the importance of your voice in the world, the more powerful that voice is going to be. Because the other things I described are literally like techniques that you can practice, but this other technique of actually affirming your own authentic voice is probably the most important one.
Yeah, the first step is what turns you on. That's always what it is. You should never write to the market. The market will always horrify you. Right now what's selling are superhero stories to the studios. But if you don't like writing superhero stories, you shouldn't say, oh, well, I'm going to write one anyway, because you'll fail. You have to write from passion. In my experience, yes, even writers who are professionals. You write from what you love, and you write from what embarrasses you, and you write from your core wounds. We all have things that we love to talk about, and those come from our core wounds. And I say every storyteller is wounded, and they're trying to tell a story to heal that wound. We all have a dozen core wounds. I'm ugly, my mother didn't love me, I'm badly socialized, no one understands me, I go to a party, I can't talk to anybody, no one will listen to me, I'm lonely, I'm alone, I can't reach out, I'm married but I'm not happy because I really can't be myself. There's all these wounds we all have, and we carry them inside ourselves. That's really what we're always writing about, always. And this is true for untherapized writers who are very successful, even if they've never looked at a psychologist's couch, and they laugh at this. When I work with them, turns out what they're writing about always is their core wound. So ask yourself, as a storyteller, what am I interested in? What are the movies I love? I guarantee you when you do that, you'll find out that is your place where you need to start. Are you interested in love? No, I'm interested in computers. well, then you might want to write a sci-fi movie because you're sort of mechanicized, and that's your bliss. But I guarantee you that comes from a core wound too. So you must start with what excites you, and then shaping it is just a matter of, after you've done a passion draft, what I call just a draft of whatever you want your story to be about. It could be a paragraph, it could be a line, it could be 50 pages. Then it's time to think about, how do I want to shape this? Because the shape is always going to be the same. If it's a movie or a television show, the shape will always be the same. And learning what that shape is your job as a screenwriter, is your job as a television writer. But it must have come from your passion.
One of the best questions a screenwriter can ask themselves to make the story better. One thing is how is this my story? How is, whatever this story is, how does it relate to me? So that I can use my emotions to go to tell this story better. Because what the weirdest part about being a screenwriter is that we sit in a room alone, we are isolated from society, we basically are cut off from emotional situations. We hate conflict, we hate all of these things that then we're going to use. Those are the elements we need to use to make our story passionate and emotional and all of those things. So all the things that we sort of fear to deal with, we now have to deal with. And so basically look at the story. One of the things with assignments that I have to find a doorway into an assignment. So if I am offered a deal, if I'm offered something that I read a book, whatever, some assignment where they're going to hire you to write the script, I have to look at that and go, how is this story my story, so I can tell it honestly? Because if it has nothing to do with me, then I'm just taking money and typing. And the bad part about that is the script will not work. The worst part about it is then you may have to do it a couple of rewrites after that on a script that becomes torture. It's like, I'm just typing this, I'm just writing it, I have no connection to the story. So then it becomes work. And you know, if any of us wanted to do work, we wouldn't be writers.
So even if the story is not exactly similar,
no, it doesn't have to be exactly. There has to be, yeah, exactly. There has to be something in there that's that I can relate to. If I don't relate to the story, then it's like I don't get this. So it's like I can. I had a meeting with the people that did the Tom Clancy Jack Ryan movies once, and I can totally relate to Jack Ryan, even though I've never been in the Navy, down the line. But it's like I am a guy that is the bookworm who knows things but doesn't necessarily know how to, isn't the action guy. So that's the way that I can get into that story. And I think that if you look at the, Harrison Ford Jack Ryan movies and the Baldwin Jack Ryan movies, those really have the guy who's the fish out of water, who's the brainiac who now has to do action stuff. Where the problem with the reboot version was he was the action guy who had to do action stuff. It doesn't work. It didn't work as a movie, but that wouldn't, if I were offered that, I would say I can't do that story. I can't relate to that character. I can relate to other characters, but I'm not sure I can relate to that character. So you kind of look at things and go, what's my doorway into this story? And it could be something where it's symbolic. It could be something where, if, I'm trying to think of some example now and I can't off the top of my head, but the weirdest part about assignments is that you end up being offered things you go, that's a movie? So somebody offers you Lego, the motion picture, and you immediately go, there is no story there. But if you find the story in there and you go, okay, I'm going to do a story about a rebel in a world where everything is awesome, I am a rebellious type person, so I can see that story. So you find your story in there. And sometimes you look in the material and your story isn't there. There's things you will be offered that you go, I could hack that out and make money, but it would be hack work. So I always try to turn those down and try to wait for somebody to offer me the job where I go, I want to do this project.
Have to meet the hero. Have to show the hero living his or her everyday life before anything extraordinary occurs that's going to move the story forward. You can have something extraordinary if it's part of that character's everyday life, but it can't be the thing that is going to get the hero moving toward the climax yet. It's static in a certain way. It's the everyday life. And the other must-have is you must create empathy with that character. We've got to connect with that character psychologically. Now, to me, the key ways a writer would do that is you either get us to feel sorry for the character, make the character the victim of some undeserved misfortune. So in Avatar, at the beginning, we find out that he's been crippled in the war and he's just lost his brother who was killed, and that's why he's there taking his place. So all of that is designed to immediately get us to sympathize with this character, and that creates this empathy or psychological connection. Another way is to create jeopardy for the character, put their life in danger if it's an action movie, put their job or their love life in danger, anything that's of importance to them, because we identify with characters we worry about. And the third way is you make them a nice person, good-hearted, generous, kind, show them as well-liked by other characters. So you have to have at least one or two of those as you introduce the hero so that your audience or your reader will actually become that character psychologically. I mean, that's what you're going for. To me, movies are participatory. They aren't something we observe, they're something we step into. So in Titanic, we're the ones on the sinking ship. We're the ones falling in love with Leo DiCaprio or whatever, because you establish this empathy. Those to me are the essentials.
That's good.
What we care about is to see a character overcome a deep weakness. Now, the audience thinks that the story is all about the hero achieving his goal, right? Because then we've got success, and that's important. And in most stories, the hero will accomplish his goal by the end of the story. But that is not what the audience is most interested in. They can't tell you this, but we know from lots of experience, hundreds of years of storytelling, that the real fact is not does the hero accomplish the goal, but does the hero overcome the great weakness? Because that's what makes us care about that character. We see them in pain, we see them in trouble, right? If they're already successful, if they're already a good, and in some cases a perfect person, where do they go? Right? There's nothing for them to overcome. So that's why it's so important that we show in the very opening pages of our script the great internal weakness of our character. Now, we may also want to give them qualities that are likable qualities that the audience can also hook onto, but those are not nearly as important as establishing the weakness up front in the story.
One of the things that I think is important is to know why your villain is right and why your hero is wrong, or protagonist and antagonist. Because often what happens is people don't know why their protagonist is wrong. Their protagonist is 100% right. Or why their antagonist is right, you know, is on the right track. And people are multidimensional, you know, we're not all good and bad. So to find the good in the bad character and the bad in the good character are critical to making that a three-dimensional character. And that's a tough thing for a lot of new writers, is they just want to have their hero wants to be, as a projection of themselves, they're the perfect version of themselves. But the problem is a perfect person is dull. We like flawed people. You know, we want, the example that I always use is Liar Liar, because Jim Carrey's character is a bad father and says so. And he is a terrible father. Now, he means to be a good father, but he's not. So that character flaw being the guy that, I mean, his biggest character flaw is he believes that a lie is better than the truth. So he lies to everybody so as to not hurt their feelings, and instead hurts their feelings twice as bad when they find out that it's a lie. But he is a character that's not 100% perfect. He's a bad father. And his journey from bad father to good father is what the story's about. And often what happens is new writers don't want to have that journey. They want to have the character be a good father all the way through because I'm a good person and this character is kind of part of me, and so they're going to be always good, and they don't want to explore the bad part of themselves, and we all have those. None of us are perfect people. We all are flawed. So you need to sort of dig into yourself often and find the bad parts of you and deal with those, on screen. Did I already say you're basically you're taking the things you wouldn't tell your best friend and telling, 100 million people worldwide. That's part of that.
One of the things about structure that I found that sort of changed more than anything for me, because I didn't realize this for the first 10 or 15 years that I was a consultant and lecturer, and that is, I always thought of plot structure, meaning it was the sequence of events and the things that happened, and that's sort of externally. So and it is a plot structure, and there are certain key things that need to happen at 25% and 50% and 75%. But the revelation to me was when I realized that the inner journey the character takes also has a structure, and it's exactly the same structure. The same 6 stages apply to that. And that intertwining of that outer journey and inner journey, as I said before, that to me is where it gets both fascinating and really helpful to writers, because they can really integrate those two things.
What's a good idea, what's a bad idea? I'm saying that there are no bad the good news is there are no bad ideas. Why is that good news? Because, well, I can't have a bad idea. The bad news is it doesn't matter. It's not about ideas. This is not about ideas. Ideas are not important in dramatic narratives. That's a mouthful to say and gets me a lot of criticism. I was at a scholarly conference. I was telling you that I rarely go to scholarly conferences. I go to a lot of writers' conferences, but it was at an academic scholarly conference. And someone said at a writing panel, this was out of town, this was up in Montana. He said, the problem with your program at UCLA, I really wanted to hear the rest of this, is that we encourage writers to write screenplays that are, get ready now because I've memorized this, too deeply encoded into the dominant narrative mode. I'll say it again. We encourage writers to write screenplays that are too deeply encoded into the dominant narrative mode. So I thought to myself, what in the world is that? And then I realized narrative is usually what they say when they mean story. I heard myself say to him, because I was very confused, I said, you mean story? And he said, yes. And I said to him, guilty. You're right, that's us. We're story hardliners. We think it's all about story. He said what we should be doing is inculcating into new writers the respect for the value of ideas. Sounds great, doesn't it? But I was saying, well, I'm so sorry, but we think ideas are worthless and useless. Again, it doesn't go over very well, but it's the truth. Any real writer who's a serious writer who has any kind of success will tell you it's not about the idea. And sometimes when they say, oh, I got a great idea, and they really believe that it is a great idea, it's not just an idea. In fact, it's a story that's all worked out. For example, with King's Speech, it's not just a guy who stutters and hires a speech therapist. It's the King of England. It's World War II. But all of this, as we start to describe it, it's no longer just the idea. Now you're telling the story. I'm going to say it again. It's so obvious that it's hard to see. Sometimes things are so obvious you just can't see them. And again, here it is. It's all about story. That's all it's about. It's about telling a good story.
Often people, they're afraid to create the conflict because the conflict gets into the messy stuff. And so they hold back on the conflict when we need to get into that conflict. There's a thing that another screenwriting problem is delaying things because well, that conflict really can't happen until this point, this point in the movie when we're at this point. Well, what usually happens is they stall until they get to that conflict. When instead what they should do is have that conflict happen here and then have things just continue to get worse. So that scene here, instead of being the beginning of the conflict, instead is when the conflict's a hell of a lot worse. They don't escalate their conflict enough, and escalating conflict is important. Again, it's in dialogue, it would seem false if that character didn't say, there's a problem and here's what it is, or I have an issue with you, and they need to have that issue. It needs to start here, you know, the fuse needs to not just be lit, but then it needs to explode, and that explosion has to start a chain reaction of other explosions. So that's like an Act 2 problem often, is writers try to hold everything off until Act 2 when you need to kick off with, you know, with something exciting happening.
A lot of people think you think the thing up in your head and then you write it down, but he says the writing down of it is sort of the thinking of it, that there's a nexus between the pen or the keyboard, the hands on the keyboard, that kind of create it, and you just never know, and you have to live with that uncertainty. You have to sort of rejoice and celebrate and embrace that uncertainty instead of trying to eliminate the uncertainty.
I think it all happens sort of organically, and it does take a long time, you know. I think, you know, there's little ideas percolating around all the time, and you think, oh, okay, well, maybe that could be interesting, and you start writing some stuff and developing, and sometimes you find you flush it out. It's just not that, it's not going to engage you for a film. And sometimes you just find this little germ of an idea, you know, and it can just be, you know, a single thought or a little, you know, some little thing, you know, or a person or whatever, and one little thing, and then it starts to just like pool things together. You know, you start to see the resonances of different things. I really love that approach to writing a screenplay. You know, that it's an act of curiosity and discovery. I feel like when you write a screenplay, it's like being an archaeologist. You're excavating something that already exists somehow. And I think that sort of organic path for me is definitely the way that bears the most fruit. When I try to be clever or try to do it in a more strategic way, I think the results are less interesting. But when it just comes, you know, my second film is about a yoga teacher who meets her biological sister for the first time.
Half-sister.
Half-sister. For the first time as an adult, and her half-sister is a sex worker. I mean, for me, like, this came partly like I was doing some volunteering in a homeless shelter, and I talked to this woman, and she told me this story, and you know, it was just something about her and this story about being rescued that really, you know, just like it got me, you know. And I started thinking about just people from different walks of life. And for me, I'd worked as a yoga teacher, and I actually taught in a social welfare center for prostitutes for a while, and that had really made an impression on me. You know, I thought about, a lot about those women and the violence with which they lived, and you know, how does someone help them? And you know, it's when you start like just pooling things together that you're interested in, and it starts to make its own shape. And I feel like you can't force that phase. It's sort of like having a baby. It just grows by itself in your belly for quite a long time before you give birth. And I think writing a screenplay is like that. You know, you have to allow yourself that gestation period, you know, where you're just, you know, letting things percolate and letting yourself like just wander and letting yourself be open to what might be around the corner that could be the thing that, you know, that explains something. I feel like it's a, you know, it's a journey. You know, writing a screenplay, it's a journey. You're discovering this thing. And you just want to be really open to what it could be and enjoy it. And certainly doing Obs to Lydia, it also happened in a really organic way, where I had certain ideas, but then when we went out to the desert, it was sort of like, oh, it just suddenly made sense. This is a road movie, you know, and it's a road movie about two people going to this place that's really what the earth is going to look like in the future, you know, and they're obsessed with that. And I feel like as a screenwriter, I often see this kind of advice to screenwriters, which goes something like, you know, read the trades and and see what's selling, and you know, and then write something like that and study other screenplays. And I think, good God, you know, I mean, I think reading a lot of books is very important. I think watching tons of movies is super important. Reading some screenplays so you understand the format and the craft, but then like allowing yourself the space to really go off the reservation, you know, and just allowing it to form in its own way. Because the first draft is really, I mean, it's just the start of a very long journey. You're going to rewrite your script at least 20 times before you shoot. You know, I've never heard of anyone that does less than probably 20 drafts from a first script to a shooting script, you know? If they do, I'd love to meet them. But I think most people, it's you know, it's a process, you know? And your first draft, you just want to make yourself as free as you can and as honest as you can and as curious as you can and let things unfold. And that will, I think that gives you the best chance of writing something that's going to be, you know, engaging and unique.
Well, before I write anything, I just think about it a ton, and I really make sure that I feel like I have the arc of the story and the characters, and I know where things are going roughly. But you know, once I have that and I decide that I'm going to take the time and write this thing, the first 7 days honestly are just writing feverishly in a row without ever looking back, so that I don't have a chance to destroy the idea before it has a chance to live. That's really what it's about.
I mean, I do have a thing when I'm writing a first draft where I generally say I write 4 to 5 pages a day. Once I start to write the script, you know, like I'll let myself have months of just like pulling things together. He'll know, and I'm always buying books that are connected to whatever it is, and watching films, you know, just filling up all the well in a sense. And then I reach a certain point where I'm like, I'm ready to write the script, you know? And then I'm totally strict about just, you know, I'll set myself like 4 pages a day or 5 pages a day, and that is it. Like, there's no excuse. You know, if it takes you all day, it takes all day. If it takes an hour, it takes an hour, but that's the minimum you're going to write every day. And I get the script done that way. And, you know, I think like when you're in that process, like somewhere, usually before you actually start writing a script, you just know, like, it's just, if it's not that interesting to you, the resonances aren't there, if you're having to force it, you know, at this stage, then I feel like abandon it, jump ship, you know, because at that stage of gestation and leading up to writing your first draft, if it's not holding you, then it's not gonna hold you, you know, and maybe it will come to you later. You know, I have had that experience, and I think actually my second film was a little like that, because I think I'd had the idea, I've had it for years percolating, you know, the idea of a yoga teacher and a sex worker and this relationship between them, you know, and so it was something, but I couldn't really find it, I couldn't really crack it before, and then suddenly it was like, oh yeah, I get it, they're sisters, you know, and different things, you know, came into that. So, you know, I think sometimes if you do have a good idea, but it's not quite working out and you're having to force it and you're pushing through it, you know, sometimes the best thing is just to leave it, set it aside, work on something else. And then maybe it's a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, you come back to it and you go, now I know what that needs, you know, and it can go again.
That's really hard to say, because it's over the course of many months, you know. So I think there's a point where there are enough notes down on page, and you understand your story enough where it's time to start writing those pages. So I might write a page, he'll write a page, we'll start sharing them. I know that we used, for both films, I think we used Google Drive, and we were sharing a lot that way. You know, we also go about it where we eventually get to a point where we have the Post-its on the wall. And that's when you actually can get a film or your idea or your script up on the wall, and like with hundreds of Post-its, and it makes sense from beginning to end. I think that's when we decide to start assigning each other pages and scenes. So we'll say, okay, look at that scene. I think I got a handle on that scene. I'll take that. Can you take that one? Because I don't have a handle on that one. And then we share them, and then we start to compile this thing, and that's how that's done.
I think the best part of writing a script is when you've actually written enough of the beginning, the middle, and the end that you have visualized the whole entire puzzle in a certain way. So now you're just along for the ride, and it's not like painful and hard and trying to figure anything out. You figured it out. Now it's just like, I'm going to sit down and write this scene, or I'm going to put that scene, I'm going to put this scene here, I'm going to put this scene here, because I think of screenwriting like a puzzle. I very rarely write in chronological order. I will literally write a scene that I know is going to be in the movie. I might write the ending. I mean, I literally, and then I'll start moving. Oh no, this scene goes here, this scene goes here. Now, some people do that with index cards. Like they'll put the thing together with index cards. I just do it in the script. I just cut and paste and put that scene there, and I'll like write a scene and then just go more, knowing that I'm gonna write more scenes there, but knowing that I needed to write that scene. So I think once you have actually, I guess, it's a confidence thing. Once you're confident that you know the story and the characters, and they're going to, you know, it's like, hey, I can see Vegas. We're gonna get there. It's right there. I see the lights and everything.
I'm in Barstow.
Right? I mean, right there it is, right? That's like the most exciting part. There's a little bittersweet thing. It's great to finish. Like, yes, of course you love to finish, but there's a little bittersweet thing to finishing. It's sort of like finishing a good book. You're like, oh my God, it's over.
Right.
Now what am I gonna do? Okay. Is there more than, no, it's over.
It's over, right,
like it's done. So there's a little bit of something that, you know, and I think people feel that when they read a really good book, and they're just like, wow, I'm not gonna see those characters again, and that was amazing, but it's done.
There are things you're supposed to do as a writer that you should do. You should make an outline, you should make your character breakdowns. There's all these things that you like do, and you make your cards, and you plot out your story, your first and second and third. I don't do any of that. I do none of it.
That's the perfect screenwriter.
Yes.
That's one that has the folded sock drawer.
Yes, that's the guy who does it all correctly. I don't do any of that. I like to sit and think about the idea, and then I like to think about the character, who that woman or man is, and what they're like and what their world looks like. And then I just start to think about what the movie might look like in my head. And once I sort of start seeing the movie itself in my head, then I start writing it. I don't know how it's going to end necessarily, unless it's a thriller. If it's a thriller, I need to know how it's going to end so I can know where I got to go, if that makes sense. You know, because you always want to have that ending that people go, oh. So you think of the ending first. Like, what would be a cool, oh. And then, oh, okay, now how do I get there? So I go backward if it's a thriller. If it's not a thriller, if it's just a story about people and life and love or whatever it is, then I don't really think that much about what's going to happen. I just sort of think about the people and where they are and where I want them to be, what the world's like, what they enjoy. There's usually a lot of wine involved because I enjoy some wine. What happens is I end up writing, I think, something that's much more organic and much more, here I am a writer and I can't find a word. What is the word? Organic and what is it? What's the word when something just spontaneous?
Spontaneous.
Organic. I end up writing something that's more organic and spontaneous because I haven't sort of telegraphed it. And kind of like when you're acting, you know, you always hear, don't play result, you know, because you've read the entire script. So your character is on a journey. So you know what that journey is, but the character doesn't know. So you don't want to play like you know what's coming because you'll telegraph it to the audience. I find the same thing works for me as a writer. By not knowing everything when I'm writing, I'm discovering it as I'm writing. And it makes the writing process exciting for me because I'm like sitting there at the keyboard. I'm like, this is great. You know, people are like, well, what's going to happen next? Like, I don't know. I can't wait to find out either. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a spontaneous thing. And then hopefully the training and the laws of inevitability that I try to keep focused in my head, you know, kick in as I'm writing. And when it's done, it's a really great story. But yeah, I like to look at it as a living, breathing story that's unfolding as if I'm watching it. And that drives me toward the end. Because I feel like if I do all the outline stuff, for me, if I do all the outline stuff, I've already kind of done it already. So now it's like, oh, now I gotta write it all. I already figured it out. So I just like to jump in and start writing.
How to improve a scene that you're working on. The first thing, before you even start writing the words of the scene, you want to step back and, as usual, my advice is ask questions. In other words, first of all, you should have already asked the questions, who is my hero? What is the hero's wound? What are they afraid of? What is their visible goal that they're going after? And where structurally does the scene occur? Because depending on how far along in that inner journey the character is, that's going to affect how they would react in the situation. After you've figured those things out, then the next question you want to ask is, what does my character want in this scene? And is that desire going to, or do they think it's going to move them closer to their goal, or at least overcome an obstacle to achieving their goal? If the answer to that question is no, then the scene should be jettisoned. It's not serving the story, because every scene has to move the character closer to their visible goal, or force them to face an obstacle or anticipate an obstacle that they didn't know they were going to previously. So let's say the answer is yes, though you do know that this is going to contribute to the goal, and you figure out what do they want to accomplish within the scene. Where do they want to be, or what do they want to have happen to the end of the scene? Then, what are they going to do to try and do that? That will constitute the action of the scene. The dialogue you just set aside until all these other things are figured out, because the dialogue is only really to reveal in some way how they're feeling about the situation, or it's dialogue where they're trying to persuade somebody to do something or get above somebody else, take control of a situation, and so on. But first you want to see, what does the character want in the scene, and then what is the obstacle they must face in the scene to achieving that? Because the emotion of a movie and the emotion of any scene is primarily going to grow out of the conflict. If it's not the conflict being faced right then, it's the conflict that they are anticipating, or occasionally that the audience is anticipating. In a thriller, we may know that the killer's in the next room and all the hero wants to do is get to the kitchen to make a sandwich, but it's still about what do they want and what are we anticipating is going to get in their way. And then when it comes to dialogue, especially if you struggle with dialogue, get something down. You should get anything down to begin with, just so you've got a scene to work with rather than a blank page. But if you don't know what the dialogue should be, write dialogue where the character is just saying how they feel and what they want. It's what's known as on-the-nose dialogue. It's terrible dialogue, but at least now you've got a scene. You've got action, you've got character, you've got dialogue, and now you can ask the last question that would be my suggestion, and that is, okay, now I know what they want. They're going through this action. How can I make it more difficult for them, first of all, but also, instead of having them announce their feelings or desires, can they do it without saying anything? Or if they, in a conversation, how can they hide their true desires or feelings and cover it up with more surface, superficial, subtextual language? And that's sort of what you're going for. And those are sort of the beats of going through it. Then it's a matter of just going through that process again and again and again with each successive draft. But that'll get you to something if you're looking at a blank page to begin with.
I find endings to be easy. I do. It tells me, the story tells me how it wants to end. The characters tell me what needs to happen. I think the hardest part for me is the middle, is like, you know, creating, you know, a situation that has real conflict and real confusion and real stuff to work through that's not just cute or convenient for a script, you know.
I almost always know the endings of every one of these movies before we even set down the road to, you know, to start breaking it out point by point. I mean, I knew the ending of Starlet, I knew the ending of Tangerine, I know the ending of the next film. So that's because I think endings are very important to me. Same goes for Prince of Broadway and Takeout. So with all of them, I knew the ending was almost more important than the beginning. This is the first time I'm thinking about this sort of stuff, so I haven't been asked these questions before. So, but yeah, no, I think it's actually, I focus more on the last scene and the impact the last scene will have. That's almost one of the first things I think about. You know, with Tangerine, it was the only thing we thought about. When I went to, you know, to start our research process, Chris Bragash and I went to the corner of Santa Monica and Highland, and we started introducing ourselves to people, etc. You know, just telling them what we were going to do. When we finally found Maya and Kiki, I said, I only have like a few ideas here, and one of them is, well, first off, it has to take place on one day because we have a limited budget and costume changes cost money and continuity costs money. It's easier to shoot in a film that takes place in a 24-hour period of time. The second one is that I think people are coming together, or someone's trying to find somebody else, or whether that's a love story or a revenge story, I don't know. And the third is this ending. I know, I can see the ending. I can see all my characters converging at the end at donut time in a big climactic scene. Those were the only things I saw going into it. So it's funny, yeah, it's funny you say, it's funny you bring that up. The endings are very important to me because it's about how the audience leaves the theaters, you know. I think very much so about the impact of that last scene. If you think, I look at my favorite films, and my favorite films are like Harold and Maude, and when he's walking away at the end after, you know, the car goes over the cliff and you think he might be in it, but then he's up on the cliff and he's with his banjo. You have, you know, most of my favorite films have such incredibly memorable, lasting scenes that have an impact on the audience as they're sitting there during the final credits. And I think that that's something I'm always conscious of. It's the most important thing for me in a screenplay.